Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. It's exciting. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Caudill, Chair of the Economics Department in the College of Business at FAU. Our presenter this evening is Will Luther, who is also a professor in the department. In addition, Will is the director of the American Institute for Economic Research's Sound Money Project and an adjunct scholar with the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. The Social Science Research Network currently ranks him in the top 5% of business authors. Will has published articles in leading scholarly journals, including the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Inquiry, Public Choice, the Journal of Institutional Economics, and the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance. His popular works have appeared in The Economist, Forbes, and U.S. News and World Report. He has been cited by major media outlets, including NPR, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Time Magazine, Fox Nation, Vice News, RT, and the Washington Examiner. Dr. Luther earned his MA and PhD degrees in economics at George Mason University. A little bit about today's program. I believe Dr. Luther is going to make about a 40 to 45-minute presentation on the COVID contraction. We welcome questions, so please ask, but note that questions will be answered at the end of the program, though they can be submitted throughout. Okay, Will?
Thanks, Steve. So I guess I don't have to explain to any of you that we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, but maybe you feel less comfortable when it comes to assessing what's going on with the economy. And so what I would like to do today is first just think about what a basic macroeconomics model would tell us to expect to happen given the nature of this shock to the economy. And then think about some of the particular things that have gone on in this pandemic and try to attribute what actually explains the contraction that we're observing. Is it the shutdowns that have been posed, or is it just people choosing to produce less? And then finally, we'll take a brief tour through the history of economic thought to consider, in a broad sense, what we might do to make matters better today. What kind of policies can we adopt? And then perhaps in the Q&A, we can consider whether some of the policies we've actually adopted are in line with what we would presumably want. Okay, so just to, I guess, anchor the conversation, keep in mind that the coronavirus, it really started in China in December. And in December, it was, not anything that was getting much attention. Into January, they were realizing some more cases, but it really wasn't until February where those cases started occurring outside of China. And at that point, people around the world started to take notice. The risk of going out was presumably higher than it had been just a few months earlier. Certainly our perceptions of risk were higher. And so people, both regular folk like you and I, deciding whether to go to work or whether to have our employees work remotely, and politicians who were considering policies recognized this growing risk and then started taking steps to mitigate that. Now, a pandemic is what macroeconomists would refer to as a real shock. A real shock typically means that we're experiencing a reduction in productivity. Now, that might seem a bit odd to say that we're experiencing a reduction in productivity, but think about some things that were produced this time a year ago, like cruises that were relatively safe. So with a given amount of capital and labor, there were so many relatively safe cruises that we're able to produce. And now with the same capital and labor, that is, with the same machines and equipment, tools, and the same workers, given their same skills, we're not able to produce those relatively safe cruises. And this is across the economy. Relatively safe dinners, out of reach today. We can't produce those as effectively as we could a year ago. And so in that sense, we're less productive than we were. But there are some things we should keep in mind about a real shock, especially a real shock of a pandemic nature, and that's that it's temporary. So perhaps Tanya can pull up the second slide there, and we'll see roughly what a basic macroeconomics model would predict. So if you don't have to be familiar with a basic macroeconomics model, you can just take my word for it there. The next slide, thanks. So on our vertical axis here, we have output. We can think of that as real GDP or real GDP per capita, not much change in labor from year to year. And on our horizontal axis there, we have time. And so at time one here, the economy is hit with an exogenous shock. In this case, the shock is the pandemic. And this pandemic makes us less productive, and so output is going to fall. We're going to experience some negative GDP growth. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But again, this is just temporary. At some point in the future, we develop a vaccine, or we learn enough about the virus so that we're able to transact with one another at a much lower risk than we could in, say, March or April, when we didn't know a whole lot about that virus. And as we learn more and as we develop technologies like vaccines to deal with this, then we will begin producing again. And so output will increase and output growth will return to be positive there. And then finally, if you look there at the last black line, we have output growing at roughly the same rate that it was prior to the shock. But if you look at the dashed line, that dashed line is the trajectory of output growth that we would have gotten if there hadn't been this shock or any other shock. And so in the long run, we would expect that production is a bit lower than it otherwise would have been because this negative thing happened to us. And so the intuition there is that there is some human capital that would have been learned, some physical capital that would have been accumulated, some new ideas, some better production techniques that would have been developed. But since we were poorer, we did less of all those things. And so there's a small lasting effect of that. The big question, of course, is what's the distance between T1 and T2? And what's the distance between T2 and T3? And finally, how much lower is Y2 than Y1? That is, how bad is this going to get? And how long is it going to last? And unfortunately, our basic macro models aren't very good at making those kind of predictions. But intuitively, we should expect that as we become more equipped to deal with the risks associated with the coronavirus, then we'll be able to pick up production and move forward. Another question that I'll return to near the end of my remarks today concerns the long run trend here. So I've suggested that it's going to be a bit lower than it was prior to the shock. Of course, the question is how much lower? And that's going to depend, as we'll see, on how long this period of reduced production lasts. So just for starters, let's see how our model is predicting. Tanya, you can advance the slide there. If we look at real GDP, huge contraction in real GDP. So we can see that difference between Y1 and Y2 pretty big. I've produced this chart going back to the Great Recession. That's the gray bar there from late 2007 into 2009, just so you can see for comparison how big this economic downturn is. Now, there are some differences between our current problems and the problems we had in 2007, 2008, and 2009. In 2008 and 2009, we had relatively tight monetary policy. That is, nominal spending had contracted sharply. And that seemed to take some time to work out. here we're dealing with a real shock. That's a different kind of macroeconomic shock. And typically we rebound much quicker when we're just dealing with a real shock. But we haven't really dealt with real shocks of this magnitude. So how quickly we'll bounce back is somewhat up in the air. If you've been on Twitter recently, like my colleague Steve, sure he's been surfing the Twitter. You'll know that there's a big debate among economists about how to report this reduction in output. Some people will say this is a 10% decline in real GDP per capita. Other folks will say it's roughly a decline of roughly a third in real GDP per capita. The short answer is that there isn't a short answer. The way you should report this data depends on how you're using this data. So this is quarterly data, but it's actually annualized. So what we're looking at here at any particular point in time is how much has been produced in the last 4 quarters. And so we can see that the 4 quarters from quarter 2 backwards is about $52,000 per person, whereas 4 quarters at the beginning of the year and backwards was a little over $58,000 per person. And so annual GDP to date, that is through quarter 2 of 2020, has fallen by about 10%. But all of that decline, or most of that decline, there was a mild decline there in quarter 1. The bulk of that decline occurred in 1 quarter. And what we're really concerned with is what's going to happen in the next quarter and the quarter after that. And so this is how I'll explain the 10% versus 33%. If you think that we're going to go back to production as we were, roughly a year ago in quarter 3 and quarter 4, then annual GDP will be about 10% lower in 2020 than it was in 2019. That is, we will have those quarter 2 declines, but no declines thereafter. If, on the other hand, you think that we're going to continue producing through quarter 2 and quarter 3 at the roughly the same level that we produced in quarter 2, then you're looking at roughly a 30% decline in GDP for 2020 relative to 2019. And perhaps you think it's going to get worse. Well, if that's the case, then we're looking at GDP in 2020 being less than 2/3 of GDP in 2019. So this is a huge decline. It's hard to overestimate how big this decline has been. And so whether you want to call this a 10% decline in quarter 2 for the year, or whether you want to call this a 33% decline, and either way, we're talking about a really big decline, a decline that's much bigger than the decline that was realized in the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. And we just don't know yet whether it's going to be closer to 10% for the year or closer to, say, 33, 35% for the year, or, God forbid, even worse. Now, we don't have data into quarter 3 yet, and of course, quarter 4 hasn't happened. And so we get some sense of how much that initial decline was, but we don't know whether we're going to go further, and we don't know whether or not the recovery has kicked off. But there are at least some promising signs. So Tanya, if you want to advance the slide there. So if you look at the stock market, doesn't matter whether you look at the S&P 500 or the Russell 3000, there was about a 34% decline in the stock market there from February to April. And that's largely been offset with a stock market recovery. And so at least markets are expecting that this is a temporary shock. It's not going to last forever. We produced less in Q2 than we did in Q2 of 2019. We'll probably produce less in Q3 than we did in Q3 of 2019, but there is some end that markets are seeing. It's not going to last forever, and the long run viability of the companies that are trading on the stock exchange is bouncing back accordingly. We see that in labor markets as well. Next slide. So perhaps you saw the cover of the New York Times, which showed that unemployment claims had skyrocketed, and they had. And the unemployment rate initially was reported to go up to 19%, but that eventually got revised down. The revised data today tells us that the unemployment rate, which had been around 3.5%, shot up to around 14.7% there in the spring. The May numbers came down to 13.3%, shocking most professional forecasters, and the June numbers fell further down to 11.1%. And so it looks like a recovery of sorts is occurring, but I would suggest that cautious optimism is in order. So one thing that you should understand is that in March and April, about 28 million people lost their jobs. And of those 28 million people, around 10 million were furloughed. So these are people who, they still have jobs. So they're unemployed, but they still have jobs to return to. They've just been temporarily furloughed, and their employer and the employee, they both expect to return to work at some point. It's just not clear when that will be. The other 18 million people were actually separated from their jobs. And so they're going to have to find a new job. Now, perhaps some of those will, submit applications and return to the jobs where they were before. But at least the available payroll data suggests that around 18 of the 28 million people who lost their jobs in April and March did so in a way that means they have to find a new job. And so when we see this unemployment rate coming back down, we should understand that mostly what's happening is those 10 million furloughed workers are going back to work. The bigger question for the long run is how long it takes these 18 million people to find new jobs. Perhaps the unemployment rate will continue to fall as it has in May and June, or perhaps these declines will just be the furloughed workers returning to the jobs that they never really lost. They just weren't getting paid there for a period. Either way, I think we have to interpret this as good news, even if it's a good news in a terrible situation, because many professional forecasters and economists were actually expecting those 10 million furloughed workers, at least many of those 10 million furloughed workers, not to return to work. That is, they were expecting that some of those furloughed workers would become separated from their jobs, even though they hadn't been separated from their jobs in April and March. To date, that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, many of them have returned. All right, so just to recap, what we have is a real shock hitting the economy. That real shock is this pandemic. And the pandemic, to be more precise, reduces productivity in two ways. The first, by increasing the riskiness of economic activity. We all stay inside. We don't go to work, some of us at all, some of us working remotely. Perhaps Steve has been exceptionally productive over the last few months, but I suspect many of us would have been more productive if we were in our offices. That is, after all, why our employers make us come to the office every day. And so surely that's a decline in productivity on net. The other thing, of course, is that state governments, and in some cases local governments, began issuing orders that closed businesses, prevented economic activity from happening. And so we can see those two shocks, underlying shocks there associated with the coronavirus. But it might be interesting to figure out what is explaining what. Is it the shutdowns that are causing the contraction in economic activity, or is it just people concerned about the virus and staying home? Next slide, please. So I have looked at this empirically. So here we have the effective date of state-level stay-at-home orders. So the darker the color, the earlier the order was introduced. So you can see that the first state there, California, introduced its stay-at-home order in March 19th. And just remember that date, March 19th. So that was the first stay-at-home order date. That'll give us a bright line against which to look at the data that's coming. By the way, all of this, the state-level stay-at-home orders dates was collected by the New York Times. And so I just went to the New York Times website there and collected the data there. So I'm reasonably confident that this is accurate, effective dates of state-level stay-at-home orders. But if you find an error here, email the New York Times. Not my fault. Okay, so a lot of states, most states, 42 states adopted stay-at-home orders. And some of these states that didn't adopt state-level stay-at-home orders nonetheless had stay-at-home orders in place. So Oklahoma didn't adopt a state-level stay-at-home order, but they did adopt an order that required, I believe it was those over 65 and those with any medical conditions that would make them particularly at risk to stay at home. Other places like, let's see, Wyoming, right? Wyoming did not adopt a state-level stay-at-home order, but Jackson, Wyoming did. And much of the population of Wyoming lives in or around Jackson. So that was a pretty significant stay-at-home order, even though it wasn't technically a state stay-at-home order. But again, the date we want to keep in mind there is March 19th. That's when these state-level stay-at-home orders went into effect. Now, several companies that some of which you're familiar with, like Google and Apple, have released smartphone data. And what this data does is, anytime you're out and about, they collect location data, and they've taken this location data and created an index that takes into account the number of visits and length of stay at various locations. And they group the data into several locations, like residential locations, grocery and pharmacies, parks, workplaces, transit stations, retail and recreational, and they've made this data available. And so if we take a look at the residential data, next slide, I'll explain what you're looking at here. Each of these lines corresponds to a state. You can't, if your screen is the same as mine, you can't see the horizontal axis there. But it says this is the residential activity index. And so this tells us this is an index that's taking into account how long people are at home. And 100 corresponds to the average across the same day of the week in January and very early February. So if it's a Tuesday in April and you're staying at home just as much as you were staying at home on a Tuesday in January, then the index value for you would be 100. Since this is a residential activity, A value over 100 means that people are staying home more than they were in January. And so you can see that all of these state residential activity index start moving at about the same time. That is, shortly after March 8th, folks decided to start staying at home more. Presumably, they were looking out and seeing the deaths outside of China rising, realizing that it was riskier to be out and about, to be making transactions that they deemed inessential. And so they started spending more time at home. Now, the date that I asked you to remember there, March 19th, you can see that much of this change in residential activity happened before March 19th. So at least in terms of residential activity, it appears that people were staying home before they were being forced to stay at home. Next slide. So these series, it's exactly the same data, except for that I've just taken the average across all states, the average across states that have adopted a stay-at-home order, that's the red line, and the states that have not adopted a stay-at-home order. And you can see that both in states that did adopt a stay-at-home order and states that didn't adopt a stay-at-home order, the average state in those groups was increasing their residential activity, that is, they were staying home more, roughly to the same extent and more or less in lockstep. Now, after March 22nd, the stay-at-home states do appear to be staying at home a bit more than the no stay-at-home states. I would caution us against taking that as evidence that the stay-at-home orders are necessarily effective. We have a big empirical problem here, which economists would call an endogeneity problem, which is that states that are adopting these stay-at-home orders may be fundamentally different from states that are not adopting those stay-at-home orders. And so the particular risks of being out and about, perhaps because of things like population density or temperature, whatever the case may be, would make a place more risky and hence also increase the probability that policymakers would impose a stay-at-home order there. And so we do see that those states without stay-at-home orders aren't staying home quite as much as states with stay-at-home orders, but interpreting that as purely being the effect of the stay-at-home order is probably going a bit too far. Okay, so we've looked at the time series here. If you take a look at the next slide, again, I have the same data. I'm just going to present it a little differently. So I've shown you the individual data, that is the data for each state. I've shown you the averages across states that adopted the order and those that didn't. And now we're going back to each line being a state, but I have changed the horizontal axis. And so now, instead of the horizontal axis being a date, it is the number of days before and after the stay-at-home order. And so basically, I have just shifted all of those lines so that they line up along that zero line on the day that that particular state happened to adopt the stay-at-home order. And so 0 for California is March 19th. 0 for Florida is, what was that, April 3rd or April 4th, something like that. And so in those two states, the 0 point corresponds to different days, but they're both days that correspond to the date the state adopted the stay-at-home order. And again, we can see that much of the change in residential activity seems to clearly have taken place before those stay-at-home orders went into effect. We saw this if we just used California, that is the earliest state. It looked like most of the activity had taken place before. And now when we're using the actual date for each state, we can see that somewhat more clearly. residential activity picked up before the stay-at-home orders. Next slide. I have the same style charts here. This is for retail and recreational activity indices. And so this is the flip side of the staying at home coin. If you're staying at home more, you are retailing and recreationing less. So again, an index value of 100 would correspond to your visits and length of stay at these retail and recreation locations in January. And we see that around the same time there, shortly after March 8th, retail and recreational activity begins to decline. And it seems that much of that decline took place prior to even the first state adopting that stay-at-home order there on March 19th. Next slide. Okay, so again, we have all states, the stay-at-home order states and the no stay-at-home order states. We have a very similar pattern here, right? We see that the average state in both of those groups begins to reduce their retail and recreational activity around the same time. Around March 22nd, as some of these stay-at-home orders are going into effect, we do see that the stay-at-home order states seem to be reducing their retail and recreational activity to a greater extent there than the no stay-at-home order states. They all do correspond there in April. If you're familiar with the calendar, you'll note that that corresponds to Easter. So retail and recreational activity fell markedly in all states on Easter, of course, because most of those establishments were closed, or more of them were closed on that Sunday than was closed on a typical Sunday there in January. Next slide. So finally, the last chart I'll show you here. I've done the same thing that I did with residential activity. I just changed the horizontal axis so that instead of looking at a date, we're looking at days before and after the stay-at-home order. And we can see that even when we're not using that benchmark of California on March 19th, when we're using each individual state's effective date of the stay-at-home order, the retail and recreational activity declined significantly before those stay-at-home orders went into effect. Okay, so my view then is that much of the decline in economic activity that took place in March and April took place not because we imposed stay-at-home orders, but instead because people thought that it was more risky to be outside. So employers started having their employees work remotely. People started taking fewer trips to the store, fewer recreational activities. And of course, that meant that there was less economic activity taking place. And so as a consequence of that, we got an economic contraction. But we can be a little bit more precise here. So if you'll go to the next slide, Tanya. I do some empirical estimations and make some back of the envelope calculations. Here I have 4 of those activity indices: residential, retail and recreation, transit station, and workplace. There are 2 other indices. I'll mention those just briefly. Grocery and pharmacy. There's an index for grocery and pharmacy activity. These activities, grocery and pharmacy, weren't generally affected by the state level stay-at-home orders. That is, they didn't apply. The state level stay-at-home orders didn't apply to grocery and pharmacy activity. These were by and large deemed essential activities, and so you were still permitted to go there. But nonetheless, we do see a decline in grocery and pharmacy activity. It's not quite as big as the decline in retail and recreation, transit station, and workplace. But then again, we shouldn't expect it to be because it's generally more essential that we pick up groceries than we, say, go kayaking or buy a new pair of shoes. The parks data is a little more difficult to analyze because for most states, the index value for January, we don't have to worry about that here too much in South Florida, but the index value in most states for parks activity in January is much lower than we would expect parks activity to be in March and April and May and June as weather improves in those states. And so we actually see parks activity increase over time, but perhaps not as much as it would have increased. And since we don't have this index data last year or the year before, it's hard to build a reasonable counterfactual for how high parks activity would have been if there hadn't been the coronavirus and the corresponding lockdowns. So those aside, let's talk a bit about these back of the envelope calculations. So all of the estimations for the effect of the stay-at-home order are statistically significant, except for retail and recreational activity. So we should probably interpret the estimated effect of the stay-at-home order on retail and recreational activity as 0, but the point estimate was 1.37. So I presented that there. Our residential activity increased by roughly 1.23% when the stay-at-home orders went into effect. And so if you just do some back of the envelope calculations here and consider that that index was around 100 the 7 days beginning February 15th before any movement in the data, and was 117 in the last 4 weeks for which I have data. That means that residential activity increased by around 16% over this period on average, and only 1.23% seems to be correlated with the stay-at-home order being in effect. And so that means that only about 7.5% of the share of that decline we observed is attributed to the stay-at-home orders. So a relatively small fraction there. For transit station and workplace activity, we can do similar calculations there and see that the state level stay-at-home order accounts for about 12% and 7% of the decline in transit station and workplace activity, respectively. Again, a word of caution. So we're really looking at the effect at the point when they were introduced. And we're taking the assumption that that effect will be the same over the whole period that follows. But that might not be the case. So some people some commentators have observed that yes, individuals reduce their economic activity on their own, but they wouldn't have done so for as long if we hadn't forced them to do so with lockdowns. And perhaps that's the case. In that case, the effect of the stay-at-home order would be greater than I estimated. On the other hand, you might make the argument that we didn't know much about the virus in March, not as much as we do now. We didn't really know what kind of steps we might take to mitigate the spread or to protect ourselves while continuing to go about our daily business. And so perhaps those indices would have picked up returned to their long-run trend there if there hadn't been these stay-at-home orders, but perhaps that would have been a good thing. Hard to assess the welfare consequences of that. So the further away we get from that effective date, the less reasonable the conclusions are there that it's the individuals choosing to stay at home and not the stay-at-home orders that's driving the effect. All right, so we have a good sense of what's happened, what's going on with this economic contraction. We have a sense of what's driving that effect. Let's think about what we can do about it. And so I'll introduce you or remind you of three late economists The first is Franco Modigliani. So Franco Modigliani had this view called the life cycle hypothesis. Today we talk about consumption smoothing. And the idea is basically that while your income might vary from period to period, you want to keep your consumption pretty smooth. And so many of us have experienced a decline in income. What we would like to do is, since this decline in income is temporary, we would like to reduce our consumption by less than the full reduction in income. That is, we would like to borrow against our future income so that we can consume more than is supported by our current income today, and correspondingly less than is supported by our income in the future. The problem is that some of us face some credit constraints, and it's not easy for us to borrow very cheaply. And so as a result, we don't borrow so cheaply. And so we might want to consider some policies that effectively allow people to engage in some consumption smoothing, perhaps loans, perhaps just direct transfers, but that would be the basic idea there. Now, the second economist is F.A. Hayek. F.A. Hayek, if you advance there, Tanya, told us that in a recession, we have resources misallocated, and when we reallocate those resources, it's costly to do that. So if this recession lasts so long that businesses begin to fail, then they're going to have to, the capital that they own is going to have to go to new businesses. The labor that they employ is going to have to go to new businesses, and those reallocations of capital and labor are costly. And so that would reduce the output relative to the pre-pandemic trend even more if those businesses were to fail. And so with this view in mind, there's some scope for providing some temporary support to businesses to help bridge the gap there. Again, perhaps through financing, in order to get them over the hump so that they don't fail. And if they were able to return to normal somewhat quickly, then we would save those reallocation costs that would otherwise be unnecessary. All right, the third economist that I'll mention is Jean-Baptiste Say. Say is perhaps most familiar with Say's law, which is that supply creates its own demand. That's a pretty confusing phrase. When I think about Say, I usually characterize his views as saying that it's ultimately a matter of production. That is, we can redistribute income, but many people have experienced a reduction in income at exactly the same time. And so redistributing income is only so useful, right? The bigger problem is that in terms of the economy is that we're producing less. And the only way to fix that problem is to produce more. Now, we have some problems at the moment. It's perhaps still not safe by people's own assessments to produce. Some folks have a higher risk tolerance than others, but certainly I think it's unlikely that we would return to the same level of production as we had in August of 2019 if there were no restrictions on production today. I think we would still see some reduced production. And so it's only going to be when we feel safe, sufficiently safe to engage in that production, that we're going to improve things on the real side of the economy. And so until then, we're all going to be suffering a reduction in income, and perhaps to a lesser extent, but to an extent nonetheless, a reduction in consumption as well. All right, so that's my remarks. I'm looking forward to answering any questions that have come up.
I don't see any at the moment. Let me pull up the screen again. Do you have any insight while I'm looking this up?
I could ask a question.
Yeah, I see a question from Christopher Hill that asks how I'm accounting for states without stay-at-home orders, but cities and counties that do, like Atlanta. And the short answer is that I treat those states that don't have state-level stay-at-home orders as not having stay-at-home orders. That is not ideal, but since most of the effect being captured is before and after, as opposed to between states, it's a little less troublesome in this case, I think, than it would be in general. That's why I presented those charts that showed the before and after data, so you can get a sense that this was happening across all states, regardless of whether they ultimately introduced a stay-at-home order or not. Steve, you have a question?
Yes. If you can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Excellent. I was curious because of the empirical work that you had previously, where you were talking about activity, which I guess was sort of ambiguously defined.
Yeah.
And I guess what you might, I mean, you're looking at how much people are away from the home, and ultimately, I guess what you hope to say something about is economic activity,
That's
not
right.
just. And I can tell you that might be something that you also could look at, because I know my own behavior vis-a-vis the store has changed, because I find I'm making one trip and spending way more money because I don't really want to go to the store and pick up all the stuff I forgot. So I'm probably, my economic activity in just food expenditures may actually be higher because I don't eat out as much and I don't go to the store as often. I make one trip a week and buy, I'm just shocked at how much money I spend at the store.
Yeah, so certainly there's some of that. So a couple of things just on our shopping habits. If you look at that grocery and pharmacy index, I didn't present the chart here, but it actually picks up around the same time that all of the other non-residential activity indices begins to fall. And so you just like we would experience here in the run-up to a hurricane, people prepare. And so my own personal observations is that grocery expenditures probably decline in early April because people had freezers full of food, and so they they made much of their early April purchases in mid to late March. But you're right. After that, the activity index probably overstates the decline in grocery and pharmacy sales. But I would still expect those to be declines. And here's my anecdotal evidence of that. So there's some research that in a recession, we don't just produce less, but we also move to lower quality goods. And in a period where where economic growth is high, we don't just spend more money, we also switch to higher quality goods. And if you take a look at your supermarket, you have probably seen a lot more primal cuts of meat recently than you would have a year ago, right? That is, it's much easier to buy, say, a picnic pork, and fewer people are buying say pork chops, which have been processed a bit more. And so we do see people moving to lower quality products. This is in part because they're home, they got more time on their hands, and so the opportunity cost of their time is lower. But I'm expecting that those grocery bills are probably lower on net. The other thing we see is that personal savings has increased. This is if the recession were to end today, it would be a very peculiar recession, because it would be a recession where most people's balance sheets actually improved during the recession. Usually we don't see that. But think about it. Some of us right? Some of us, like you and I, Steve, still have the same jobs that we had in January. And so our incomes haven't fallen or haven't fallen much, but we've spent a lot more time at home. And so our consumption has fallen considerably. And so we are saving more than we otherwise would have. But even people who have lost their jobs, many of them qualified for not just unemployment insurance, but the expanded unemployment insurance, which for relatively low wage workers, and I say relatively low wage, so certainly anyone making less than $15 an hour, with the $600 in addition to the 40 to 60% of your salary that you get in unemployment benefits. That means that for a $15 an hour worker, their effective wage for a 40-hour work week was 140 to 160% of what it would have been if they had been working all that time. Now those benefits are expired at the end of July, the top up, and it's not clear if they're going to get extended, and if so, by how much and for how long. But at least to date, many people have seen their balance sheets actually improve. Obviously, we're not taking into account the present discounted value of our future tax obligations. There's no free lunch here, but on a personal level, taxes aside, it's kind of a weird recession.
What kind of implications would this weird recession have if the weird recession ever ends and we come out of it with people with more savings? And I mean, that, as you say, that's peculiar, but it should have some implications at the end of this tunnel if we ever get through it, correct?
Yeah, there are really two things, right? One is that since it's a temporary supply shock, a temporary real shock, we should expect a quick bounce back, right? It's not like we have less capital or that we have all, forgotten how to do our jobs. We still have the same physical and human capital for the most part that we had 6 months ago, a year ago. We still have the same, knowledge about how to combine that physical and human capital to generate output. It's just not safe to do so at the moment. So the moment that we feel that it's sufficiently safe, we can ramp up that production. The asterisk on that is that if firms are still in place, right? If firms go bankrupt in the meantime, then we're going to have this period of time where capital and labor is being reallocated, and so we wouldn't get such a swift recovery. But at the moment, if there were a vaccine today and a sufficient number of people took it, and we all felt like this thing was over, then climb as quickly as it declined. So that's one thing. The second thing is that in terms of monetary policy, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, has taken steps it's increased its balance sheet by roughly $2 trillion. So prior to October 2008, its balance sheet was around 800 billion. Through the Great Recession, quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3, it increased to around 4 trillion and declined to around 3.7 trillion with the light tapering. And today it's almost 7 trillion. And so a huge amount of asset purchasing there by the Fed. Now the Fed has a new operating regime that it adopted in October 2008 that allows it to have that big balance sheet and not worry about inflation too much. But in order to do so, it has to compensate banks for holding those funds as opposed to lending them out. And so there's a non-trivial risk that if there's a quick recovery, given that this new operating regime is new, and we don't have a lot of experience with it, that the Fed could make some significant errors on the back end. That is, it could err in the not sterilizing quickly enough, in which case we would get some significant inflation for a period. It could err in the contractionary, as it could try to err on the side of not permitting that inflation, in which case the recovery would take longer. But we don't really have a good way of assessing which way we think those errors are to be. Markets, for their part, are currently expecting around 1.6% inflation. I get that by looking at the spread between 10-year treasuries and treasury inflation protected securities. So that's currently estimating an inflation rate of around 1.6%, which is roughly in line with the inflation rate that was expected prior to the pandemic. So it dropped to less than 1%, but it's since recovered back to around 1.6%. And today, of course, Jay Powell mentioned that the Fed would be considering its 2% inflation target more as a symmetrical target than a ceiling. So if you believe that, you should try and lock in a long-term interest rate today, because presumably we would have higher than 1.6% inflation moving forward, something closer to 2% on average.
Tanya, have you anything else?
Nope, I was just about to say, I think that's it if we want to just wrap it up. If you want to give your contact info for where they can contact you, and we'll have this up on YouTube for everyone to view again.
Great, yeah. You can reach me by email at wluther@fau.edu or on Twitter at William J. Luther.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, Steve.